There can be a quiet feeling that your value is connected to what you are able to produce, even if that connection is not something you have consciously decided. It does not always appear as pressure, and it does not always feel overwhelming, yet it can exist in subtle ways that shape how you move through your day. Moments of rest may begin to feel slightly unsettled, not because rest itself is uncomfortable, but because it is no longer associated with a sense of being enough. The mind can begin to search for something to complete, something to improve, or something to move forward, even when nothing immediately requires your attention. What you accomplish can start to carry more weight than how you feel, gradually becoming the measure through which your sense of worth is interpreted. This shift does not happen suddenly, and it often develops through repeated experiences where doing is recognized more clearly than simply being. Because of this, stillness can begin to feel less familiar, while movement becomes the place where value seems easier to confirm. Without realizing it, your sense of worth can begin to follow the rhythm of what you produce, rather than remaining steady on its own. There can also be moments where even small pauses feel incomplete, as if something is missing when there is nothing actively being created or improved. In those moments, the absence of activity can quietly translate into a sense of absence in value even when nothing has actually changed about who you are. Rest can begin to feel unfamiliar in a way that is difficult to explain, not because there is anything uncomfortable about stopping, but because stopping no longer feels complete on its own. There can be a quiet sense that something should be happening even in moments where there is nothing that actually needs your attention. This feeling does not always appear as urgency, and it does not always form into clear thoughts. Yet it remains present enough to make stillness feel slightly unsettled. Without something to focus on or move forward, the mind may begin to search for a task, a goal, or something that can restore a sense of direction. This search is not always intentional, and it often happens in the background, shaping how rest is experienced without becoming fully noticeable. Moments that could feel neutral can begin to carry a subtle tension, where the absence of activity feels like something that needs to be filled. Because of this, rest can slowly lose its sense of ease, becoming something that is tolerated rather than something that feels naturally complete. The absence of movement may begin to feel like a lack of progress, even when nothing is actually missing. There can also be a quiet assumption forming where doing something becomes the way to return to a sense of balance, even if that balance was never truly lost. In this space, stillness is no longer just stillness, and it begins to carry a meaning that was not originally there. At some point, the idea that your value is connected to what you do can begin to feel less like a belief and more like something that simply feels true. It may not come from a single experience, and it may not be something you can clearly trace. Yet it can take shape through many small moments that quietly reinforce the same message. When effort is noticed, recognized, or rewarded more clearly than presence, it can begin to shape how worth is understood without needing to be explained. Because of this, doing something becomes more than just action, and it begins to carry a sense of meaning that feels tied to how you see yourself. Moments without output may then begin to feel less defined, not because they lack value, but because they are not interpreted in the same way. This creates a quiet imbalance, where what is visible becomes easier to measure, while what is simply felt becomes harder to recognize as equally real. The more this pattern continues, the more natural it can seem, until it no longer feels like something you are following, but something that reflects who you are. There can also be a subtle expectation forming, where being at rest begins to feel like a temporary state rather than something that can exist on its own. Within that expectation, value begins to feel conditional, shaped by what is being done, rather than held steadily regardless of activity. When a pattern is experienced repeatedly, it can begin to feel less like something learned and more like something that has always been true. The connection between doing and worth does not need to be stated directly in order to take hold, and it often forms through quiet reinforcement rather than clear instruction. Each moment where effort is recognized more clearly than presence adds to a sense that value is something that must be demonstrated. Because this reinforcement happens gradually, it does not stand out as a change, and instead becomes part of how things simply are. What begins as a subtle association can develop into something that feels stable and unquestioned, shaping how you interpret your own experience without needing to be examined. The absence of that association, on the other hand, can begin to feel unclear, as if something is missing when there is nothing being produced or improved. Over time, this creates a system where worth feels tied to movement and stillness feels less defined in comparison. This system does not need to be maintained actively because it continues through repetition, guiding how you relate to both action and rest. Within that structure, being becomes something that feels secondary, while doing takes on the role of something that confirms your place within your own experience. Once this connection between doing and worth becomes familiar, stopping can begin to feel less like a neutral pause and more like something that interrupts a sense of continuity. There can be a quiet pull toward movement, even in moments where nothing requires your attention, as if staying still creates a gap that feels difficult to hold. This pull does not always feel intense, and it does not always take the form of pressure. Yet, it can remain present enough to guide you back into action without much awareness. The idea of pausing can begin to feel uncertain, not because rest itself is unclear, but because it no longer carries the same sense of reassurance. What once might have felt like a simple break can start to feel incomplete, as if something is left unfinished, even when nothing is actually missing. Because of this, continuing to do something can feel easier than remaining in a space where value is not being actively confirmed. The absence of visible progress can begin to create a subtle tension where stillness feels less defined compared to the clarity that comes with movement. There can also be a sense that stopping too long might lead to losing momentum, making it harder to return to the rhythm that feels familiar. Within this experience, movement becomes not just something you choose, but something that feels necessary to maintain a sense of balance. With repetition, this movement can begin to feel automatic, no longer requiring a clear decision to continue, but unfolding as something that happens almost on its own. What once felt like a choice can gradually become a default response, where doing something feels more natural than not doing anything at all. There may be little awareness of when this shift takes place, since it develops quietly through consistency rather than through a single defining moment. As this pattern becomes more established, it can begin to guide your behavior without needing to be questioned, shaping how you respond even before you are fully aware of it. Moments of pause can start to feel less accessible, not because they are unavailable, but because the system has adapted to continue without interruption. The mind may begin to anticipate the next action before the current moment has fully settled, creating a rhythm that favors continuation over stillness. This anticipation does not always feel urgent, yet it carries enough momentum to make stopping feel less natural than continuing. Because of this, activity can begin to feel like the baseline, while rest becomes something that feels temporary or secondary. There can also be a quiet expectation that something should always be moving forward, even when there is no clear direction that needs to be followed. In this way, the pattern sustains itself, supported not by force, but by the ease of repetition that no longer requires conscious effort to maintain. As this pattern becomes more consistent, it can begin to feel less like something you are doing and more like something that simply reflects who you are. What started as a way of responding to expectations can gradually take on the quality of identity, shaping how you understand yourself without needing to be questioned. There is often no clear point where this shift becomes noticeable, since it develops through repetition rather than through a single defining moment. Because of this, being someone who is always moving, always producing, or always improving can begin to feel like a natural trait rather than a learned pattern. The idea of slowing down may then begin to feel less familiar, not only in behavior, but in how you relate to yourself internally. What you do becomes closely tied to how you see yourself, making it harder to separate your sense of worth from your level of activity. There can also be a quiet belief forming, where not doing something feels like stepping away from who you are rather than simply taking a pause. This belief does not always appear clearly, yet it can influence how you experience both movement and rest in ways that feel personal rather than conditional. Within this experience, productivity is no longer just something you engage in, and it begins to feel like something that defines your place within your own life. At a certain point, rest can begin to feel unfamiliar, not only as an action, but as an experience that no longer feels fully comfortable to remain within. The idea of doing nothing may seem simple on the surface, yet it can carry a subtle sense of unease that becomes more noticeable the longer you stay in it. This unease does not always appear strongly, and it may not interrupt you in obvious ways, yet it can remain present enough to make stillness feel incomplete. There can be a quiet sense that something should be happening, even when there is nothing that actually needs to be done in that moment. Because of this, rest may begin to feel like a temporary pause rather than a state that can exist on its own without needing to lead into something else. The absence of activity can start to feel less defined, especially when movement has become the place where clarity and value are most easily recognized. There may also be a subtle discomfort in staying still for too long, as if remaining in that space creates a distance from what feels familiar and stable. This distance is not always interpreted clearly, yet it can make returning to action feel more natural than continuing to rest without direction. Within this experience, rest is no longer just rest, and it begins to carry a sense of uncertainty that was not originally there, making it harder to fully settle into it. In moments of rest, there can be a quiet shift where your attention turns inward, not toward calm, but toward questioning what that stillness might mean. Without the structure of activity, there is less to hold on to, and this can create a space where your sense of worth feels less clearly defined. The absence of visible progress can begin to feel like the absence of something more personal, even when nothing about your actual value has changed. This does not always take the form of direct self-criticism, and it may not appear as clear thoughts, yet it can exist as a subtle sense that something about the moment is not enough. There may be a quiet questioning that begins to form, not always in words, but in feeling, where being still starts to feel less certain than continuing to move. Because of this, rest can become a place where doubt is more easily noticed, simply because there is more space for it to surface. This doubt is not created by rest itself, yet it becomes more visible when there is nothing else covering it or redirecting your attention. There can also be a tendency to interpret this feeling as a signal that something should be done, reinforcing the idea that action is the way to restore a sense of stability. In that moment, doing something begins to feel like a way to return to clarity, even when the uncertainty did not require resolution in the first place. A pattern like this does not need to be reinforced deliberately in order to continue, and it often strengthens through repetition that feels natural rather than intentional. Each time action restores a sense of clarity, it can quietly confirm the idea that movement is what brings you back to yourself. That confirmation may not be obvious, yet it builds over time, shaping how you respond to moments where that clarity feels less present. When rest is followed by a return to doing something, the transition itself can begin to feel like proof that activity is what resolves uncertainty. Because of this, The cycle does not feel forced, and it does not appear as something that needs to be questioned, since it produces a result that feels reassuring. The more often this sequence repeats, the more it begins to settle into the background as something that simply works. There may be little reason to notice it, since it does not create disruption, and instead maintains a steady sense of direction that feels reliable. At the same time, the absence of that movement can begin to feel less stable, not because anything is wrong, but because the familiar pattern is not being followed. This creates a loop where doing becomes the way to return to a sense of balance, reinforcing itself each time it is repeated without needing to be examined. What begins as a quiet pattern can gradually take on the role of an internal standard, shaping how you measure yourself without needing to be clearly defined. This standard does not need to be stated directly, and it often forms through repetition that feels normal rather than imposed. There can be a growing sense of what is considered enough, even if that sense is never clearly articulated or consciously decided. Because of this, your actions may begin to be evaluated against something that exists in the background, influencing how you experience both progress and pause. Moments of productivity can start to feel like confirmation that you are meeting that standard, while moments of rest may begin to feel less certain in comparison. This contrast does not always feel intense, yet it can remain present enough to shape how you interpret your own experience. The standard itself may continue to shift, becoming slightly higher over time without a clear reason, making it harder to feel fully settled in what you have already done. There can also be a quiet sense that stopping too soon might mean falling short of something, even when that something is not clearly defined. Within this structure, doing more begins to feel like a way to stay aligned while doing less can begin to feel like moving away from that alignment. What once felt like a quiet internal standard can begin to carry more weight, not because it has changed suddenly, but because it has been followed consistently for so long. The expectation to continue producing may no longer feel like a preference, and it can begin to feel closer to something that needs to be maintained. There is often no clear point where this shift becomes noticeable. Yet the experience of it can start to feel different in subtle ways. Moments that used to feel neutral may begin to carry a slight sense of pressure, even when nothing external is demanding more from you. This pressure does not always appear as urgency, and it may not take the form of clear thoughts, yet it can remain present enough to influence how you move through your day. What you do can begin to feel less like an expression, and more like something that needs to meet a certain level, even if that level is not clearly defined. Because of this, continuing to do more can feel like a way to maintain stability, while doing less can begin to feel uncertain in a way that is difficult to explain. There can also be a quiet sense that falling below this internal standard might change how you see yourself, even when nothing external has actually shifted. Within this experience, effort carries not only movement, but also a growing emotional weight that is felt beneath the surface. Pressure does not always become visible in the moment it is forming, and it can deepen quietly while everything on the surface continues to appear manageable. What feels sustainable from the outside may carry a different experience internally, where the effort to keep meeting that standard begins to settle more deeply than you first realize. This strain does not always announce itself clearly, and it rarely arrives as something dramatic enough to demand immediate attention. Instead, it can remain in the background, shaping your energy, your pace, and your relationship to yourself in ways that are subtle enough to be normalized. Because the pattern still appears functional, there may be little reason to question whether anything is becoming too heavy beneath the surface. You may continue doing what you have always done, while noticing only small changes in how it feels, such as needing more effort to maintain the same rhythm or feeling less restored by the pauses in between. These changes can be easy to overlook, especially when they do not interrupt your ability to continue. Yet they still leave an impression that gathers over time. There can also be a quiet narrowing of ease, where your days remain full of movement, but less connected to a sense of internal spaciousness. In that narrowing, the weight is not always recognized as burden, though it still shapes the way you carry yourself from one moment to the next. A sense of emotional emptiness can begin to appear in ways that are difficult to immediately recognize, especially when everything on the surface continues to function as it always has. There may be no clear disruption in what you do, and nothing may seem obviously wrong. Yet something within your experience can begin to feel less full than it once did. This feeling does not always take the form of sadness, and it may not carry a strong emotional tone, which makes it easy to overlook or move past. Instead, it can exist as a quiet absence, where moments that used to feel engaging now feel slightly muted or less connected. Because activity continues, there may be little space to notice this shift clearly, and it can remain present without becoming fully acknowledged. The focus on doing can continue to fill your time, yet it may not create the same sense of meaning that it once did, leaving a subtle gap that is not immediately explained. There can also be a growing sense that something is missing, even if you cannot easily identify what that something is or where it has gone. This absence is not created by a lack of effort, and it is not resolved simply by doing more, yet it can quietly shape how your experience feels from within. Within that space, the connection between what you do and how you feel may begin to loosen, revealing that they are not as closely tied as they once seemed. There can be a moment where the absence you have been carrying becomes more noticeable, not because it suddenly appears, but because your attention begins to rest on it for longer than before. It may not arrive as a clear realization, and it may not form into a defined thought, yet it can begin to feel present in a way that is harder to move past. What was once easy to overlook can start to remain with you, creating a quiet awareness that something within your experience is asking to be felt rather than filled. This awareness does not interrupt what you are doing, and it does not force you to stop. Yet it introduces a different kind of presence beneath your actions. There can be moments where you begin to notice how things feel. Not only what you are doing, allowing a different layer of experience to become more visible. This shift does not replace the pattern you have been following, but it begins to exist alongside it, creating a space where both can be recognized at the same time. Because of this, the connection between doing and worth can begin to loosen slightly, not through effort, but through a growing awareness that something else is also present. There may be a quiet return to feeling, where what matters is no longer only what is being produced, but how you are experiencing what is happening. In that space, nothing needs to be corrected, yet something begins to reconnect in a way that does not depend on movement to be felt. A different kind of steadiness can begin to appear, not as something you create, but as something that becomes noticeable when you are no longer trying to define yourself through what you do. It may not feel dramatic, and it may not arrive as a clear realization. Yet it can be experienced as a quiet sense that your presence does not need to be confirmed through constant movement. There can be a soft shift in how you relate to yourself, where doing something is no longer the only way to feel grounded within your own experience. This does not remove the desire to act or to create, yet it changes the role that action plays, allowing it to exist without carrying the full weight of your worth. Moments of rest can begin to feel more complete, not because they have changed, but because they are no longer being measured against something else. There is no need to prove anything in those moments, and no need to move in order to feel that you are still connected to yourself. What remains is a quieter sense of being, where your value is not something that rises and falls with what you produce, but something that stays with you regardless of activity. This does not need to be fully understood, and it does not need to be held onto tightly, because it is already present in a way that does not depend on effort. From here, movement can continue in its own way, yet it no longer carries the same pressure to define who you are, allowing you to exist without needing to earn your place within your own life.